Thank you for having me. This is the most exciting election campaign and I can't believe it's now my fourth campaign leading the Green Party of Canada into an election. This feels very different everywhere across the country. We have campaigns and candidates who are in play in places where we've never had enough support to even begin to consider that I should make multiple visits to parts of Canada that usually aren't on the leader tour. So in that sense, I'm extremely encouraged. It's frustrating today because, of course, it's the first debate that Justin Trudeau is participating in, and I'm not invited to the TVA debate. So that has that sense of deja vu. But I will be, of course, in the debates October 7th and October 10th. And the Maclean's debate went ahead. The Monk debate was canceled. So there is that sense of feeling stalled from actually talking about issues, confronting the other leaders. But we have been having great response to our platform, which is detailed and comprehensive. Certainly the climate strikes across Canada struck a chord with people who I think are now looking at the Green Party as the only party that actually has a credible plan that responds to the science. The IPCC report from October of last year made it very clear we can't afford to go above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we still have other parties putting forward proposals that are at most failure by incrementalism. So we're encouraged and very optimistic about waking up October 22nd with a significant Green caucus. I love the idea of waking up and finding that I have to think about the curtains for 24 Sussex Drive, but I actually think the first thing to do is to tear it down. But never mind. I like to think about democracy and a sudden surge of millennial voters. And we get our first Green Prime Minister. I'd be the first elected woman. Oh, thank you, Cassidy. But the reality of it is that the greater likelihood, as everyone knows, is that this will be a minority parliament with 6 parties sending MPs to Ottawa. And that increases the likelihood of the vote on the right splitting, vote on the left splitting. People can vote for what they want. There's no need for strategic voting, so-called. So we finally, I think, are in the very best position we've ever been in to elect some very, very impressive people who are our candidates across the country.
You mentioned not being invited to tonight's leaders debate, so we would like to invite you to perhaps put questions to our viewers and to the 3 other leaders, Mr. Trudeau, Scheer, and Singh. What would you ask them if you were on the stage tonight, each maybe in order or however you prefer?
I think the most important thing is to ask, do they understand the science? They understand that as a matter of political reality, you can no longer avoid climate change. But have they actually read the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report? Have they internalized what it means in real life for Canada as a country, for our economy, for our children? If we hold to the most ambitious plan of any of the other parties would be the NDP, but it falls far short. The Liberal plan falls shorter, and of course the Conservative plan is a way to rush more quickly off the edge of the cliff that is climate emergency without responding to it effectively. I really don't, I don't want to ever make enemies in politics, which is a hard thing to do. I want to be able to work with each one of them and other members of Parliament who aren't leaders after the election, because the major call that you'll find in our platform and in our document Mission Possible is a call to approach this issue without partisanship. That we have to work together, and we have to, the model that we're advocating, which I've been advocating for some time now, is of the equivalent of the World War II war cabinet, an internal cabinet that focuses on climate as an overarching existential threat, in that inner cabinet, who, regardless of which one becomes Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Jagmeet Singh, me, Monsieur Blanchette, all of us have to steer a course by consensus, because the transformational change of our economy that's requires decision-making that's well outside status quo decision-making. So I would want to ask them about whether they really grasp the science, but I wouldn't want to do it. I mean, I can score points off of them for inconsistencies and hypocrisies, and of course that's how most people want to do politics, and I think Canadians are pretty sick of it.
You you've been really quite firm about your position on fossil fuels, and you actually seem to have drawn a line over who you would work with or not work with, and what the limit is for you,
Yeah.
right? So if you're saying no fossil fuels, and if you're saying no further development, and if you're saying no twinning of the pipeline, and taking those rather hardline positions, how, on the other hand, if there's a minority government, do you work in a kind of a collaborative way, but exert your power in minority to push the agenda towards what you want, if you've kind of crossed your arms and said no way? Like,
Well,
how do you square that?
Science-based decision-making is required. And the carbon budget that we have is far more real than we can run deficits. And of course, Greens like to have a balanced budget, but in the budget of the Government of Canada, you can run deficits. The global carbon budget, no. We are out of time. We've procrastinated for a couple of decades now, and as a result, not just we, Canada, but we, the world, have a very, very, very small window within which we can guarantee a livable world. That's not hyperbole, it's not political sloganeering, it's the science. So a hard line is required. Now, educating the others, assuming that they can open their minds to the science, that they can accept that this isn't a political position, but is a question of a threat to our society, for which the only other parallel would be global nuclear war. This isn't something you can kick down the road to another generation. This is the period of time within which we can change course to ensure we avoid runaway global warming can be measured in months and not years. So in terms of how I work with people, I said there were certain people I would not work with. I've never said...
Positions you wouldn't work with.
Well, no, it's a question of if they... Depending, we don't know, right? The more Green seats that fill Parliament, the more Green MPs there are, the greater the likelihood that in a minority Parliament we could have the kind of balance of responsibility position that the BC Greens had. I mean, look, British Columbians are more used to it than probably any other province, with the idea of what Adam Olsen, who's my MLA, called the balance of responsibility. You're in a minority Parliament, no confidence motion can pass without your support. That would be ideal, because that would then, I think, create for the other parties a significant moment of truth where they discover the science and change their positions.
What have you learned from the BC experience that will inform your approach?
That's a great question. I think Andrew Weaver and Adam Olsen and Sonia Firstnow are so outstanding collectively and individually, so I would never want to say anything that would sound like criticism, but I have learned things from it. And I'm also co-chair of something called the Global Greens Parliamentarians Association, so I have access to a brain trust of Greens who've negotiated agreements as recently as the New Zealand Greens with the New Zealand Labour, or my opposite number in Sweden, Isabella Löfven, is currently the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. So there are a lot of different scenarios that occur when you talk about, in the first past the post context, a minority parliament. In most of the democracies of the world, they're in a different situation, because they can start because New Zealand dumped first past the post and adopted mixed member proportional. My colleague James Shaw, who's now the Minister of Climate in New Zealand, was able to talk to Jacinda Ardern before the election, and they were able to go into it saying Labour and Green will work together. You can't say that in a first past the post country, because riding by riding, winner take all, you have, unfortunately, a political atmosphere that punishes cooperative instincts and rewards divisiveness. But what I have learned in looking at all those different situations, and particularly in the Canadian context, is that probably the best thing to do, not that I'm binding the Green caucus to this in future, is to emulate what happened in the Liberal minority parliament of Lester B. Pearson, working with, I think it was 19 NDP members of parliament at the time. There was never a formal agreement. And they worked issue by issue. So we got our healthcare system, we got the Canada Pension Plan, we got unemployment insurance, we got student loans without interest payments, and even over the opposition of John Diefenbaker, we got the flag, right? So that was an interesting period. And there was no formal agreement. So I think I'm unlikely, and Greens are unlikely in a minority parliament, to negotiate an agreement that says this is going to hold for a period of years. Because my assessment, and I'm not saying that I wouldn't ascribe this view to my colleagues in the BC legislature, but as a British Columbian, I felt pretty betrayed by John Horgan saying yes to Site C and putting subsidies into LNG. But he managed to skirt the letter of the agreement, if not the spirit of it. So I think our better bet, to keep everybody honest, is on confidence vote by confidence vote, what's at stake on this one. If we had a balance of responsibility, that would be, I think, against all odds. I actually sat down recently with a member of Lester B. Pearson's cabinet to discuss this, Paul Hellyer, who's and also fully engaged and really hoping that 90 something, 97. He's very supportive. So it's nice to be able to draw on personal knowledge of how the best minority parliament in the history of this country worked. And I have to say, I'd go one step farther. I'd say it was the best parliament this country's ever seen, was what was able to be done with Lester B. Pearson, of course, being an exceptional person of great intellect and compassion, and a caucus that included the likes of a hero like Tommy Douglas.
You're talking about working with other constituencies, and you were referencing Pat Carney and her support for you, and she's one of your constituents, right?
Yeah.
And then you were in Vancouver Granville, and you were supporting Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Yeah.
Your candidate was there as well, right?
Yeah.
So, Cassidy over here was raising that this morning,
Yeah.
and how there's a dissonance there.
Well, not a dissonance. The riding association, so-called, the Electoral District Association of Vancouver Granville, made a decision that they wanted to support Jody. And so the Constitution of the Green Party requires that there be a name on the ballot. So there's a name on the ballot. The Constitution requires that we have 338 candidates, so we do. But the local Greens are very clearly in support of Jody, and I put it this way, I mean, I absolutely appreciate any, the Greens and volunteers are across this country doing great work. In this instance, there's a name on the ballot, but no actual campaign, because I think as Greens, and as I said from the podium that night, we do politics differently. I think Jody Wilson-Raybould's voice is needed in Parliament. I hope to see her there after the election as the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville.
What does
Is that broadly known?
Yes. I mean, well, it was known that I went to a rally and said that. And again, the local Greens have made that clear.
Why would you have put a candidate forward?
It's our Constitution requires that there be a name on the ballot in every riding.
Your party constitution?
Yeah, the party constitution. Yeah, we couldn't make a decision that was unconstitutional. The initial request from the Vancouver Granville Electoral District Association was that they didn't want to put a name on the ballot at all. And then the Constitution requires. And, when you look back at what Andrew Weaver did in 2013, their Constitution doesn't, not 2013, 2017, the Green Party of British Columbia Constitution doesn't require a name on the ballot. So on their own, the BC Greens provincially didn't run anyone against the independents, like Vicky Huntington. So there is a willingness to say, look, if you're an independent voice and aligned with our values, why would we make a campaign?
So are the Greens in Vancouver Granville, are they essentially raising money and so on in support of Jody Wilson-Raybould?
Well, they can't do it officially as a party structure. The individual volunteers who form that executive are donating to Jody, they're working on the CEO of the EDA for Vancouver Granville is the canvassing coordinator for Amita Kuttner in Burnaby North Seymour, and most of the volunteers in Vancouver Granville have migrated either to Bridget Burns in East Van or over to help Amita Kuttner in Burnaby North Seymour, and some of them have gone to Jesse Brown in Vancouver Centre.
But are they raising money? I mean, when it comes time for Elections Canada, is there money being raised in Vancouver Granville by the Greens?
Oh gosh, no, that wouldn't be legal. No, we're talking about individual people making individual choices.
So you're essentially running a non-candidate.
That's right.
This poor woman is
Well, she signed up to be what's called a paper candidate in a nil campaign, so she knew that. That was what the Electoral District Association. We're a grassroots party, so again, this request came from the local Vancouver Granville EDA, and was accepted by the federal council. So it's got all the elements of how Greens make decisions, which is to say the leader doesn't get involved. But I couldn't be more proud of our local Greens for making a determination that even though Jody Wilson-Raybould decided not to join the Green Party, they're proud of her as their MP.
On coalition building, or working with other parties in not necessarily formal coalitions, looking at BC, I wanted to ask, perhaps, what have you learned about the limitations of that? Because here in British Columbia, the Greens were opposed to Site C, they were opposed to LNG development. Site C is going ahead. We're building a big LNG plant.
Well, I hope we're not, but that's what's planned.
What have you learned about the limitations?
Well, again, it was a very noble effort to assure British Columbians that there wouldn't be another election any minute. That margin, that balance of responsibility, that number of seats, and of course, figuring out who's going to be speaker. I mean, there was a lot of drama, and it wasn't automatically obvious how it was all going to work. I can remember sitting down with some of the biggest names in sort of the Ottawa punditry, who said to me, "This thing won't last 6 months." I said, well, no, they've made a commitment for 4 years. I think it'll hold for the full 4 years. They've made a commitment. And that was a decision that came from, I have to say, the inherent noble character of my colleagues, Adam and Sonia and Andrew, not to say, well, we're going to keep everybody off balance. We're going to make the best agreement we can make, a confidence and supply agreement that's completely transparent, that starts with we're going to move forward on the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. It says clearly we're going to move on climate action. We're going to move for our schools and move for healthcare. It's a very forward-looking and impressive agreement. But I do feel that the NDP and John Horgan have violated the spirit of the agreement by living up to the letter of the agreement to push Andrew Weaver and my colleagues as far as they can go to feeling as though we should pull the plug because this violates the agreement. Now, the climate plan that was released, and I'm always nervous about talking about provincial matters because I really do defer to Andrew Weaver as leader, obviously, but they've left the room to say, okay, if you can prove to us that you can live up to our carbon budget and go ahead with LNG, then you won't have violated the agreement. And the crunching of the numbers and how that is going to be demonstrated is currently underway. But I don't think you can put the brakes on the entire rest of the BC economy in a way that allows LNG to go forward. It's over LNG Canada, which of course is a consortium of Royal Dutch Shell and Petronas and PetroChina, which is where most of the construction will take place. We're subsidizing something that claims to create 10,000 jobs. 5,500 of them will be in fabrication in operations in the People's Republic of China. It's appalling. But in any case,
How much revenue will the project generate?
Well, that's a good question. Will it have markets? We don't know. Fracked gas is going to be... We're in a carbon bubble. We are going to be going off fossil fuels rapidly, globally, and LNG...
Oh, really? I mean, every report I see, every energy study that I see globally suggests that demand is still going up and projected to go up for the next 20 to 30 years.
Well, that then is a scenario for human extinction, and I'm not prepared to believe that we're going to go down that road. Too many governments understand this. Too many governments have now, which is a good thing. The brakes are going to be put on fossil fuels. Mark Carney sees this, and he's hardly an environmental radical. Mark Carney talks about unburnable carbon. So LNG Canada is going to be unburnable carbon. Fracked natural gas has the same carbon footprint as coal. It doesn't help us reduce greenhouse gases in China to send fracked natural gas from here to the People's Republic of China. And we don't, the scenarios for this violate everything we know about the global carbon budget. Fossil fuels are going to have to start being left in the ground. And we could say, well, there's growth scenarios over here, but I think when smart money in the investment community already sees that this is not where you want to put your investments in fossil fuels, when we know that if we exploit the fossil fuels that are currently even targeted for exploitation, we blow well past 1.5 degrees, which is not really a safe limit, but is a place where human civilization, we hope, can survive what's inevitable at 1.5 degrees global average temperature increase. We are not going to be able to see how we hang on if we're talking about where we're currently. Canada's target currently takes us to over 3. Canada's target is not the IPCC target, not the Paris Agreement target. It's Stephen Harper's target, unchanged. So when you look at all those, I mean, that's what I said my question to Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Jagmeet Singh would be, do you understand climate science? Because Greta Thunberg does, and we can't continue on a trajectory that means the window on 1.5 closes before we have made the trajectory. I mean, we need to change the direction of our economy away from fossil fuels, and quite dramatically. So I know that, and when you look at the International Energy Agency, they say both things, right? You look at their reports going back, going back at least 6 years. The International Energy Agency says we see the projections for growth in demand, but we're also saying we have to bring in a carbon tax, we have to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. We still 10 times more public money goes into subsidizing fossil fuels globally than goes into renewables. So the International Energy Agency is very clear. We have to reduce greenhouse gases quite drastically, which means we have to ramp down dramatically our dependence on fossil fuels. And fortunately, the assessment from whether it's the International Energy Agency or the World Bank or the IMF, these are institutions that are hardly known for being eco-radicals. They're all saying the same thing, which is we have to move away from fossil fuels quite sharply. And fortunately, we have the technologies to replace them. This can be done.
Can be done. I've not seen a credible engineer or scientist say that we can get to carbon neutrality, that we have the technology
Yes, we do.
now to get to carbon
stay on it,
neutrality
yeah.
by 2050 without sacrificing significantly quality of life here and in many other parts of the world.
I
So
think
we're buying it on faith. When
No,
when the
actually,
liberals say
no.
we're going to get to carbon
No,
neutrality.
well, the Liberals, you can't buy anything they say because they're still having the Harper target to 2030. And if you keep the Harper target till 2030, carbon neutrality by 2050 is not possible. So we do call it Mission Possible because it's possible. We have gone through a lot of sources. We have evidence. It's on our website, the detailed breakdown of how fast you ramp down the oil sands, how fast you can cancel fracking, how quickly you can ramp up renewables, particularly with a modernized, more robust electricity grid that has interties from each province to the other province. All of that is doable, but I would also put to you that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is climate scientists, but they also have a whole economic branch. They have a technical branch. In crunching the numbers in the October 8th, 2018 report, which was a special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, they say it's technologically possible, it is doable. Now, that's not climate scientists pretending they understand economics or technology. That's economists and experts in technology. We have everything we need to avoid going above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they assessed, we have them economically, we have them in science, the only thing we're lacking, says the IPCC, is political will. And that is particularly stark in Canada, because we've been a laggard country for quite a while now, and we're well behind. Certainly the European industrialized countries, we're well behind many countries in the world. And I don't want to rant about it, it's a tough choice. And I'm not saying people will never sacrifice. But since we're talking about whether our children are able to have anything above a deteriorating human civilization all around them. I mean, my daughter's 28 now. When she's 65, which is how old I am right now, I want her to have some confidence that if she's in an emergency, and goodness knows what device or gizmo we will use by the time my daughter's 65, to call a fire alarm, to call 911, to say I need some help or I need to go to hospital. A functioning human civilization is at risk within the lifetime of my daughter to be able to have the basic elements of a functioning human society.
Well, I mean, shouldn't we be giving up, for example, our cell phones? I mean, isn't it 300 million tons of carbon produced by people streaming video and texting
Well, that's-
on their cell phones?
there-
I mean,
well, that depends on
people
what-
are marching, and the Green Party has a massive social media campaign. So
Yeah, but-
you're encouraging carbon.
Well, I think
expanding your carbon
depending
footprint.
on where you're sourcing your electricity to run a cell phone, there's an issue, but we want to go to 100% renewable, and that's doable. A lot of the big internet companies are trying to go to more renewable energy to fund what they do and rather to source the electricity that they need. This isn't an insoluble problem. I mean, I'm not a big fan. We're not going to be a party that is trying to tell people they can't use cell phones or engage in technology. Technological advancements are what's going to get us out of this mess. But replacing, I mean, nobody really cares when you walk into a room and you flick a light switch. But if the light goes on, Canadians don't feel it's a sacrifice if that light that goes on, it's the service they want. The light goes on, if it's from a windmill nearby or a solar panel on the roof or a coal plant down the road, it doesn't affect quality of life. The light goes on. So replacing fossil fuels into our electricity sector is where we start, and this is not out of the Green Party sort of thinking out loud. There's a very detailed study that was done globally called Deep Decarbonization. It's a quite comprehensive review, and the chapter on Canada is basically the foundational planks of Mission Possible come from the studies that say, right, we already have we're lucky this way. We have an electricity grid that is largely renewable. We have to make it 100% renewable, and we have to break down some of the interprovincial barriers that, of course, drive people crazy who look at things like, why can't we get beer or wine across borders? But let's look at, we need to get electricity across borders, because when you're producing electricity in a very sunny province, and I think Alberta is going to be an energy superpower in solar because it's got the best potential of solar of any of our provinces. Well, when you're producing a lot of solar, you can sell it next door and they can use it when the wind isn't blowing there. I mean, this is what's already happening in many countries around the world. So the example I particularly like, because it's two different countries quite separated by water, but you've got Denmark and Norway, and Denmark has so much wind power that they have excess, and frankly, if they fed all their wind power on a windy day into their grid would blow up. So they have to sell it. They sell it to Norway, and Norway stores it through pumped storage because they can pump it up into reservoirs that already existed, no damming rivers required. And the pumped storage is there for when the days when the wind isn't blowing in Denmark, Norway opens the sluices and it has hydro that it basically controls. As soon as the wind is blowing in Denmark, pump more water up into pumped storage in Norway. So these are not technological challenges that should baffle us. They're actually economic opportunities for whole new sectors, whether wind or geothermal. One of the things I get really excited about, by the way, is Alberta right now has 100,000 abandoned and orphaned deep oil wells. That is a liability on the books of the government of Alberta in the billions of dollars. The companies responsible for that, some of them have walked away already, and the companies, of course, have said that they'll clean up the mess, but we have a history of knowing that doesn't always happen, to put it mildly. About 10% of those wells, so 10,000 wells, at depth have enough heat to generate geothermal electricity. If instead of pumping oil out, and they've already been abandoned for that purpose, you pump water down and up. And then you have a geothermal electricity producing station, which, by the way, uses a lot of the same skills and the same people who drilled the deep oil well in the first place. And the biggest cost of geothermal is the drilling. So that's done. So this is a really great economic opportunity to remove a toxic liability from the books of the province of Alberta, convert it into geothermal electricity. As I said, it's only roughly 10% of the wells. But the others can warm water enough to, say, have district energy for a community, run the heat for a greenhouse, something less with less heat than will drive turbines for a geothermal power plant. And we have 40,000 abandoned wells in northern BC. And when you read the report on Site C, where Harry Swain chaired the environmental assessment of that, that report was, they didn't have the mandate to talk about what was better than flooding the Peace River, but they did note that over the years, BC Hydro had been encouraged by many governments and many experts to look at geothermal. Well, we've got the drilling already done, and we need to have a look. What's the potential for geothermal there? So it's not easy. I'm not going to pretend that getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius and no more is easy. But, if my daughter needed a kidney, I'd go to the hospital and give her a kidney. There's nothing that we won't do for our kids. And we're being told by politicians that we're too selfish and lazy to walk a block instead of driving an SUV. I don't believe Canadians are selfish or lazy. And if sacrifices are required to ensure that our kids and grandkids have a livable world, that they have a world in which they can still see salmon, see southern resident killer whales, there's a tremendous public demand for the leadership that's required to ensure that we can make our kids that promise and not just applaud them on the sidelines when they school strike, but actually do what they're demanding.
Question on that point.
Yeah.
Recent polling does show at times there is a disconnect between the main issues that people are
Yeah.
concerned with preferable leaders, but then actual voting intention.
Yeah.
And we just saw that recently. So yeah, you're right, Ty. Climate change is a big concern, yet people seem to be edging towards conservative. So what's the reason for that disconnect, and what would your message to those voters be?
Well, I don't see this is the astonishing thing. Just to speak as a politician for a moment, when I was sitting in Parliament through the spring and Justin Trudeau and the Cabinet are in virtual free fall, Andrew Scheer can't get a break. He can't increase his vote. I have a lot of Conservatives coming to us as Greens and saying, we just don't see ourselves voting for Andrew Scheer. So there's issues with the ability to take up clear advantages, where in a normal political time you'd think people would go there. In terms of the disconnect, I've been working on the climate issue for a really long time. I learned my climate science when I worked back in the day when I first met Daphne, working as a senior policy advisor for the Federal Minister of Environment. I learned climate science from Environment Canada scientists, and there was no doubt about what we were learning and why we needed to take action, and it's been a procrastination. But in that period of time, we've always had this question of, well, how much are Canadians willing to pay? Starting in the late 80s and then early 90s, we began to see global warming or climate change topping the polls like 80%. And then other issues intervene. And I absolutely understand that we have an affordability crisis. That's why the Green Party platform talks about we have to provide universal child care. We have to pay attention to ensuring that people can afford a home in which they want to live. We have to bring down our health care costs by bringing in universal pharmacare. And it's expensive, but we found revenue. These are also very critical issues, and they need to be addressed. So I think it often depends on the way the polling question is put forward. But I don't doubt for 1 minute that the vast majority of Canadians would jump up and applaud a plan like ours, which says there's a role here for everybody, all hands on deck. How many trees do you want to plant in your neighborhood? Do you want to do a backyard garden? Do you want to make sure your house is 100% energy efficient? How much are you prepared to contribute based on your income? We want to get that work done. Are you handy? Do you want to put up your own solar panels? These are all things that I think Canadians want to see. I think the resistance to the carbon tax debate, not so much in this province because we have experience when it was working, but across the country, people look at $10 a ton going up, thinking, well, I don't see that works, because by itself it doesn't. So I think people's appetite for real climate action is for real climate action, and not for programs that appear to be, bold action on the margins of the status quo, right? Incremental action within the status quo is not what we need.
One of the stories this week that was a bit surprising to everybody is that our population increased by 500,000 last year, which is a bit of a surprise since that wasn't our target. As we see climate change and increasing numbers of climate change migrants, we're seeing birth tourism particularly in BC and Ontario.
Yeah.
What for you is the right number for Canada? We obviously the more immigrants we have, the more carbon we have. So where is the right number?
Well,
in terms of immigration?
In the current architecture of our energy systems, more people living here means more carbon. But in the rapid scaling up of renewables and the scaling down of dependence on fossil fuels, that particular link gets broken. We have a demographic, well, it's clear right now. I mean, there's just as many Canadians over 65 as under 15. That hasn't happened before. This is a real problem for, I'm happy to be 65. I'm getting free passage on BC ferries on weekdays. But the reality for our economy is we need more immigrants. We need to have people who will be working in the economy, in local communities, generating the tax revenue, and making sure the economy is healthy. Now, in terms of the separate piece, and that right number, for now, roughly 300,000 people a year as immigrants isn't a bad number. We can see where we are in terms of, because there are other things that are going to hit the world of work, including artificial intelligence and automation, and we need to figure out what kind of right sizing of the workforce is required. We do know that right now, in the transit, because we are committed to just transition for workers, particularly fossil fuel sector workers, need to know that their skills, I mentioned those who drill oil wells, but people who are pipe fitters for pipelines can also have exactly the right skills for putting up wind turbines. There's transferable skills across our economy. But the bottom line is, as of right now, we don't have enough workers for the work that we need to do. And by sector, I mean, this has already happened. I as a member of Parliament, I hear from people, business leaders and business owners, who can't find enough workers. So the skills shortage is more acutely a problem for our economy than unemployment right now. If you look at, I talk to a lot.
When we talk about it, so you're talking about an immigration policy of roughly 300,000 that would be skills-based.
Oh, no, family reunification too. We need to bring people into Canada. We don't believe in the temporary foreign workers program. We operate under the assumption that if you're good enough to work here, you're good enough to live here. And so we know that there's skills shortages, particularly service sector, seasonally in agriculture. But I talk to a lot of farmers in my community who have the same workers come up every year. They'd love to have them live here permanently. They know them. They'd love their families to be here. So,
What about climate change migrants?
Okay, so the climate refugee issue is one where Greens push for a redefinition of refugee in our global UN understanding of what is a refugee. Back to the IPCC report from last October, if we hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we still have millions of new climate refugees a year. If we go to 2 degrees, we have tens of millions of climate refugees a year. So the countries that are most responsible for creating the crisis, which are the wealthy industrialized countries that burn more fossil fuels per capita than the others, are going to have to be, I mean, migration is already a crisis around the world, but we are going to have to plan for and prepare for, not next year or 5 years from now, but soon, an infrastructure that's ready to accept more climate refugees, particularly in parts of Canada that want them. Areas that are depopulated. Mayors who look at their tax base and know that their schools don't have enough kids being born in that community to fill the desks, to pay for the teachers, to have the workers in the community. So we need to plan ahead for climate refugees, because that is in the cards, inevitable, and governments around the world are going to have to figure that out. And we are a country that's blessed with massive geography and relatively small population. People are going to be looking at us globally and expecting us to play our fair share of the role of taking on climate refugees. It's not, as I said, it's not immediate, but within a decade, we're going to be looking at a lot of climate refugees.
What's your definition? What's the Green Party's definition of climate refugee?
Someone who can no longer live in their homeland because it's unlivable. Underwater, permanent drought. They've been displaced by climatic events.
Period of time.
Well, forever. If it's gone, it's gone.
Right, no, but what's the threshold to determine? So we've had lots of horrible storms in the Caribbean recently, for example.
No, but
those folks be considered climate refugees? At what point do they become a climate refugee?
Well, the point is that your homeland is gone. It's no longer livable. So some islands of the Maldives have been evacuated already to other islands of the Maldives. But when you look at Bangladesh, there's a huge part of the Bangladeshi population that's 1 meter from sea level. Right. So if you're looking long-term just at sea level rise, there are a lot of low-lying island states. I mean, if we hold to 1.5, we can actually keep it from being tens of millions a year. Again, this is another aspect of the climate crisis, which is why I refuse to call it an environmental issue anymore, because it's a massive geopolitical threat. It's a security threat. And so we need to be looking at, and again, these are my off the top of my head definitions for you, but I know that in the international discussions that we've had as Global Greens, climate refugees need to be recognized, and we've been primarily looking at exactly this. If your area in which you have been living is uninhabitable, you're a climate refugee. But the reality is we're seeing a lot of displacement and migration because of permanent long droughts, collapses of food supply, Arab Spring. There's certainly articles that have been published in foreign policy journals and so on that Arab Spring and the destabilization of the region had a lot to do with long-standing drought conditions and not enough food grown locally, so displaced population. But a displaced population is a different category for me than a climate refugee. A climate refugee is one where their absolute ability to live where they live is gone, either because it's permanently desert and can't grow food, or because it's underwater.
And in terms of the entire country or just the region?
It can be within regions, yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, now, the government of Australia, when it was John Howard, actually told islands in the region, you're going to go underwater, we'll let you come live in Australia. We're not going to shut down coal-fired power just because your whole country is going to be extinct. That really didn't go over very well, but this is not a new conversation in some parts of the world.
In terms of the election in front of us, though, that's kind of a level above us. In terms of the election in front of us, you declared this a referendum on climate change.
Yeah.
Kind of laid down a gauntlet there, and are talking about a position of a Green caucus in pressuring you to drive for stronger action on the issue. Why aren't you worried about that perhaps backfiring on you, considering the alternatives and sort of a pressure to strategically vote between the major parties who, one has an action plan or a plan you deemed incrementalism, and one has a plan that is incredible. Why aren't you worried about that backfiring and sort of people voting strategically to avoid splits that would deliver the least action?
Well, I'll give you a political answer and then the honest answer. The political answer is 6 parties are in play across the country. If you count Quebec as the 6th, otherwise 5 parties are on the ballot everywhere. Current polling, we're 3 weeks away. Anything could happen. But unless suddenly Andrew Scheer develops massive charisma and a credible policy, I don't see people stampeding to the Conservatives. It's true that the Liberals have done more. I mean, I'm going to give them credit. They brought in the carbon tax. They've brought in regulations that don't yet apply to deal with methane. It's pretty weak. You could drive a truck through some of those regulations, but they've taken steps. And people like, I mentioned Mark Jacquard. Mark just endorsed the Liberals. I think he did it because he's afraid of Scheer. But it's not, and he's a friend of mine, and I respect him. But what that is all about is being, I think, unplugged from the reality that Scheer is miles away from being able to form a majority parliament. And in a minority, the parties that want real climate action can be, in fact, the force, and particularly the Green Party, because we don't doubt the climate science, nor do we misunderstand how unforgiving it is. We don't have room anymore for incrementalism. So as I describe the different parties' policies, and this is actually taking from what Bill McKibben said when he was speaking at UBC this spring, losing slowly is still losing. So, Andrew Scheer's policy of let's create more greenhouse gases and send Canadian fossil fuels overseas because they somehow have magical qualities and don't contribute to global warming once we export them. I mean, that's not credible, and the Conservative policy gets us to the point of no return faster. Justin Trudeau's policies, and I'm stunned that his platform, just released, did not change the target he was prepared to reach, kept to the Harper target, which in the last election they decried as too weak, and now they're wedded to it of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. Completely incompatible with our Paris commitment to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You could say, well, okay, so with the Liberal plan, we lose a little bit more slowly. And with Jagmeet Singh and the NDP platform, we lose more slowly than we did with the Liberals. But none of them have a credible plan or a commitment or a target that's consistent with the science. So the political answer is people shouldn't worry about strategic voting because right now we're on track to a minority parliament, and there's vote splitting on the right with the creation of People's Party, Max Bernier. There's all that first past the post, fear-based voting that we had to panic through during the Harper years when they unified the right. People are liberated from that in this election. The honest answer is, I don't care if it helps the Green Party, it helps us win seats, and all of our candidates feel the same way. We are not designing what we say in public because we think it's the best way to get votes. We don't know as much about politics as the Liberals and the Conservatives. We wouldn't attach ourselves to the things they say because they represent a position of moral irresponsibility. So if you're going to tell people the truth, we're in a national election campaign. In the one window we have to hold to global average temperature increase that matches what the IPCC says we have to do, it's enormously challenging. We have to start now. We should have started 30 years ago, but we have to start now. So if we're the voice that says this is what we have to do, and we're honest and we're clear and we have a plan, if there's a backfiring blowback, it's not a calculation what I'm saying, it's the truth. And that makes it impossible for me to do anything other than to keep saying, Justin, Andrew, Jagmeet, read the science. Let's work together. We've only got this one chance.
So are you saying, though, then, if, unlike in BC, if the Greens held the balance of power and the Liberals didn't move off their current position and the Tories didn't move off their, regardless of where, we'd be back in an election very soon because you wouldn't back either party?
That's correct. And I think that, I think the tragedy of Justin Trudeau's first term, or maybe only term, depending on how the election goes, is that he had a majority, a false majority under first past the post. And then the arrogance set in, and that we don't have to keep our promises set in, and we can buy a pipeline, and we can waste money on pipelines that don't have any kind of economic base case to support them. I mean, all of that, and violating the promise that 2015 would be the last election under first past the post. Imagine that he'd been in the situation John Horgan's in, where he kind of look over your shoulder and say, okay, well, what will the Greens do if we break our promise on electoral reform? What will the Greens do if we break our promise on climate? Anyway, that's what happened in 2015. I believe firmly that the political statements of the 2015 and 2019 election campaign will be rather more malleable after an election where one of them really wants to form government and knows that the price of forming government is saying, okay, the $10 to $13 billion of public money that we were about to spend on a pipeline that is still being challenged in the courts and that violates the rights of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish First Nations, that doesn't make sense in any scenario where we're going to meet our Paris targets. I don't think they'll be as attached to that in a parliament where becoming prime minister rather depends on changing your mind. I mentioned my colleagues around the world. Bob Brown, who was leader of the Australian Green Party, negotiated with the Conservatives on the right in Australia. They called the National Liberal Coalition, the funny name of a party, but I think that's it. So they negotiated there. They negotiated with Julia Gillard in Labour. Julia Gillard had run an entire election campaign on saying no to carbon taxes. She had an epiphany. She became prime minister and brought in carbon taxes.
You said earlier that technological advancement is what's going to get us out of this, and yet you've also been talking about this robot tax and where the money would flow and so on. But surely isn't any kind of a tax on robots or AI or whatever essentially a disincentive to research and development?
Valerie, I'm so glad you asked about that, because it's been misinterpreted as if we were calling for that within like the first year's budget of a green government. It's a conversation we need to have. We need to analyze where are there the kinds of job replacements that happen where it's appropriate to make sure we collect the revenue that for the robot that's replaced the human, Where's the revenue replacement for that? Now, the term robot tax is Bill Gates' term. He's popularized it. So Bill Gates is hardly someone that we think is against innovation and technology. But the discussion of this is something that's going to hit us. It's in front of us, and I find the other party policies seem to have been written based on what's in the rearview mirror. What's in front of us is a disruptive change that could mean that a lot of Canadians don't ever actually have a job. We're in a society where the revenue streams come from automation and AI. There's tremendous potential for good, obviously, in automation and AI. We need to make sure that we analyze it in advance and that we think around this key piece of revenue. So that's where it comes from. It's not a call for an immediate tax on automation, but it's to say this takes study, thoughtful analysis in advance. And that's why Bill Gates raised it. That's why there are a lot of think tanks around the world looking at it. What will it mean for the future world of work? What does it mean for societies if increasingly the jobs that we think of as absolutely permanent become impermanent?
A bit of a follow to that. How do your platform calls for a pretty significant increase in corporate tax.
Yeah.
Well, corporations obviously need to be on side, depend on them to
Yeah.
automate or
Yeah.
innovate. How does this not act as a disincentive for them?
Well, first of all, we don't touch the 9% rate, which we called for in 2015 for small business. Small business is the driver of our economy, employs far more people than large transnationals. But the larger corporations, the issue here for me is that the corporate tax rate dropped. I mean, it used to be 28% when Paul Martin was Prime Minister. It's now 15%. We can bring it to 21 and be in line with the U.S. But the reality is that I was terribly fond of Jim Flaherty, so I can't ever take his name without saying, the late and quite decent human being, Jim Flaherty, our finance minister. But when he brought in those cuts to the corporate tax rate, it was described, some of you may recall, as cutting taxes for the job creators. Well, they kind of blew it. The job creators, with the benefit of lots more cash, didn't reinvest it in the economy, didn't hire more workers, continued to lay people off. They didn't create jobs. What they did do is create, again, quoting Mark Carney, created a big pile of what Mark Carney called the dead money. It's not working for anybody. It's not investing in our economy. When investment in our economy is relatively flat, which is why we need a green government to bring in things like the major infrastructure project that a Canadian grid strategy, east, west, and north, is really where the $13 billion that we won't waste on the Trans Mountain Pipeline should go to the massive infrastructure improvements that we need. So back to the job creators. If they'd wanted to make sure they could hang on to 15% tax rates, they should have invested. But they're sitting on the dead money, and, it's like, given my theological background, I want to say, like Lazarus, money, get up and walk.
I don't know if that analysis fits with what recent analysis in BC by the BC Business Council that looked at large employers versus small employers.
Yeah.
And found that there are only 2% of all the employers in BC were considered large employers. But when you looked at their wages, they were on average, their employees' wages were 36% higher than the smaller employers. So they are investing in people. If you look at that's money actually going into the hands of real people.
But they
It's
also
not dead money.
But they're hiring fewer people. They've laid people. The commercial banks lay people off even when their profits are high. No, we in terms of looking at this, and I don't disagree with your point. Small business employs more people, largely in the service sector. The wage profile is lower, that's for sure. But when we're looking at the amount of cash amassed as a proportion of GDP, it's staggering. So the tax that we're proposing isn't punitive. I mean, it doesn't go back to what they were paying in the early part of the 2000s when it was a 28% tax rate. This is not designed to drive business out of Canada. We're quite certain that at what used to be, this is a tax rate that even existed in the early part of the Harper administration. We're going back to that at 21%. We have other places that we're looking, we obviously want to look at the offshore tax havens. The Panama Papers revealed quite a few Canadian names. We need to buttress and change the focus of the Canadian Revenue Agency per the reports from Sheila Fraser to the late Michael Ferguson. We've had the Auditor General looking at CRA and saying, why aren't you going after the people with the money? Why are you going after low-income earners that you think owe the money? Then there's the financial transaction tax. There's a few places where, and looking at e-commerce and making sure that the Netflixes and Amazon and Google and Facebook pay something into our economy because they're mining our economy for billions. So we pull together revenue sources. None of them are intended at all to do anything to hamper corporate activity. Far from it. We need innovation. We need to actually, one of the things that will help unleash entrepreneurial instincts in this country like nothing else will be to finally stop subsidizing fossil fuels and actually create a level playing field for the companies that are trying to get through.
Corporate tax rate encourage research and development? Doesn't that leave companies, big companies, who tend to put the most money into research and development with less money to do that?
Their track record isn't very good. I'm sorry. You look at the productivity index, look at what they've done with the money they've got. We are low on productivity. We are not, our large companies are not investing the way they should. We should have, if we want to improve our productivity index, we should look at a lot more value added to the raw materials whether it's fish or forests or mining. We need to drive up the productivity index. We need to show that we're actually exporting more manufactured goods and relatively fewer raw materials. So I think the productivity index does matter to Greens, but we don't see that the lower tax rates for larger corporations have resulted in improved R&D or improved productivity or reinvestment in the economy. There's a lot of cash just sloshing around. And that is the conclusion of many economists, Don Drummond among them. We look at what economists are saying about how well other government's tax measures have worked. And I should have mentioned by now, while we're talking about taxes, that we're calling for the first tax commission since the 1960s, because our tax code has become so complex with so many governments bringing in boutique tax cuts and little programs here and there that it's even my friends who are accountants and do people's taxes for a living say, that tax code, oh my. So we want to have a root and branch review. Is it progressive? Is it working? What more could we do to encourage investment? We certainly want to encourage developers to build purpose-built rental housing. We had that program in the early 70s. We killed it. And that's, we have a housing crisis, and part of it is the rental stock hasn't really been improved since they got rid of that tax break for developers. We want to make it easier for people who've built a condo and can't sell it to rent it by getting rid of the, there's a deemed GST hit to any developer who's sitting on empty units that haven't sold yet. The logical thing when there's a housing crisis is to say, right, we're going to rent this out for a year or two, but as they do that, they get hit with a GST as if they'd sold it. So we're just looking at common sense solutions to make it possible for businesses to flourish. We're not against business, but we don't think that the 15% tax rate cut for the large corporations has delivered on the promise that they would invest in the economy, hire more people, or improve R&D, or deliver better productivity, because the indexes, and you're quite right, the one they do pay more for the few businesses that are held by large companies. We're on the side of small business, and we want to make it easier for them.
Can I ask one more tax
Sure.
question? The $400 million you're proposing to take out of Canadians' pockets with the 10% tax on sugary drinks.
Yes.
Isn't that going to disproportionately hit lower income people?
It will disproportionately benefit lower income children where empty calories replace nutrition because it's a cheap way to feel full. And this sugary drinks tax has been a plea and a policy recommendation from the Diabetes Foundation, from the Heart and Stroke Foundation. It's a health-based measure.
Yeah, but doctors don't have to worry about the extra 10%
Well,
bottle of pop either, but
we have to make sure that our schools are, we have a school lunch program. We believe that it's not about being a nanny state. It's about being clear that these sugary drinks are a health threat. And rather than, banning sugary drinks is a step too far, obviously, but we have had sin taxes on cigarettes and alcohol, and our kids and, children of this generation, it's the first generation where our children are going to be less healthy than their parents. So that's a combination of things: sedentary lifestyle, back to the gizmos and not playing outdoors, all of that. But health and nutrition really matter, and our platform is very focused as well on local food and food security and access to healthy food, access to an apple that's locally grown instead of a bottle of pop from a transnational called Coca-Cola that is not a healthy food product. It's not food at all, and we need to pay attention to that. So the tax on sugary drinks is to encourage that you may say, well, I'm sending you to school with this thermos that's permanent and reusable, and in this thermos, I'm putting a healthy fruit juice that's not from, fruits obviously have sugar as well, but I'm putting in your thermos something that you will like drinking later today. There's healthy drinks and there's empty calories. And sugary drinks have been identified by the medical community of this country for quite some time as the source of an increase in diabetes, which of course has an impact on our healthcare system. But just in terms of the health of children, that should be a priority, whether or not it saves our healthcare system down the road. It does actually save our healthcare system down the road to have a tax on sugary drinks, but that's not my main motive. I think a lot of parents in Canada want to be able to have access, and certainly our goal is want to have access, I'll finish the sentence, to healthy food for their kids. The goal of the Green Party, of course, is to eradicate food banks by eradicating poverty, and that healthy food is available and there aren't food deserts in communities and so on. But the analysis around healthy food is that a tax on sugary drinks is a good start.
Maybe we could ask a British Columbia specific question on the just transition. I heard you talk about that cross-country checkout. But in British Columbia, you talk about getting away from fossil fuels. Your platform is to ban hydraulic fracturing.
Yeah.
That has climate change appeal if you're in southern British Columbia, but if you're in Fort St. John or Dawson Creek, that's people.
Well, not everybody likes the earthquakes or the fracking.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
How do you respond to people who see their job disappearing immediately? Like how much longer are they working, and what do you tell them about what their future is?
There are more jobs right now in the transition to a green economy than we have workers to fill them. We accept the recommendations, which we think were very thoughtful and well developed. The commission was put in place by Catherine McKenna, but the Liberals haven't accepted the recommendations yet on a just transition strategy specifically for workers in the coal sector. And it was co-chaired by an environmentalist from New Brunswick named Lois Corbett and by Hassan Youssef, from the president of the Canadian Labour Congress. They asked for $400 million for that part of the sector for transition. That's also in our budget. It's not designed to be the exact equivalent to the sugary drinks tax. It's just how it worked out when PBO crunched the numbers. Fracking is banned in Quebec. It's banned in Nova Scotia. The moratorium on fracking is being eroded right now in New Brunswick, which is a shame. Fracking is, as I said, the fracked gas has the carbon footprint of coal. It threatens the groundwater supplies in terms of contamination with toxic substances. As of today, Environment Canada can't even tell you what chemicals are used in hydraulic fracking. They can't list them. They can't tell you what they are. And at the same time, it does cause an increase in earthquakes. I would have thought that any human technology that caused an increase in earthquakes, that would have been the end of it, but no. So fracking across Canada being banned is part of our plan. So what I say to people in terms of just transition is you have skills. You're not unskilled workers. You have skills. We need those skills in building up the new electricity grid. We need those skills. If you're a carpenter, an electrician, or a plumber, boy, do we need your skills, because we want to retrofit every building in the country. We're going to have to get a lot more people trained up in the trade schools where we're not charging tuition anymore, with apprenticeship programs that are supported, because we need workers throughout Canada in the communities in which people already live. I'm very aware, too, of the recommendations of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry around man camps. We need to create the jobs in the communities where people live, and there are more jobs than we have workers. So for anyone in that category of being fearful of the job, the details of that committee that looked at just transition for coal workers starts with you listen to the workers, You bring them on board and start talking about it immediately and early. You go into the communities that are going to be affected. You work with them on what they need to see because this is coming. We haven't done a great job in the past in Canada. I mean, 30,000 people lost their jobs overnight when the cod moratorium came into Atlantic Canada. It was a disaster, and it was also an ecological disaster. We are not, this is moving out of fossil fuels is not the first time we've decided there's an industry that's too dangerous. Quebec shut down asbestos mining. They didn't do a great job on the transition for workers, and many of those workers, of course, were also affected by working with asbestos and have health-related asbestos issues. We can get this right, but it starts with not telling workers this is what's about to happen to you. It's respecting workers enough to say, what would you like to do? Now, as backing up again to what's already recommended, which was great ideas from this Just Transition Task Force, bridge financing for workers of a certain age who'd rather have a bridge right into their pension. Transferable skills in a jobs bank so people can look at, okay, I've got these skills, where are my skills needed across Canada? And is there funding to help me get to that location? Is this pay commensurate to what I need to pay my mortgage? Is there something in assistance so that I can get a pay that's the equivalent of what I need to pay my mortgage? The elements of this plan have been really, I think they're groundbreaking because the term just transition is in the Paris Agreement. Trade unions from around the world worked to get that in the negotiated agreement, including a lot of leadership from Canadian unions. We're as a party, we're very pro-union. We're pro a workforce that has protected rights within the trade union movement. We want to make sure we're working with workers, not telling them what's about to happen. I know it's scary for people, but I promise you, failure to act on the climate crisis is way scarier. And we need to figure out how the individual worker isn't left feeling like they're now standing on a trapdoor that's going to open up underneath them. Oh, they're all pacing?
Can I ask you one
Sure,
question?
Daphne.
There's a candidate, there's a story from last night, a candidate, one of your candidates has admitted that he wore blackface. Would you change your vetting process because you seem to be having a few eruptions?
Well, there's only, no, our vetting process has been quite exacting, but we've never had a question on the questionnaire, which is interesting. I mean, would Justin Trudeau have passed vetting of the Liberal Party? He's still the leader of the Liberal Party, and he had repeated episodes which constitute racist behavior and are really shocking. The candidate in question, Marty Lancaster, regrets deeply that he wore a Halloween costume in which he thought being Mr. T was a good Halloween costume. He's mortified because a lot of Greg Malone. Well, Greg Malone didn't like the skit, asked CBC to change the skit. He was the founder of Codco and was appearing in a CBC national television program a couple decades ago. So I'm very proud that Greg Malone is running with us. He is a brilliant satirist, a great social activist.
But if you regret, then if it's okay for your candidates to regret, is it okay for Trudeau to regret?
Well, I haven't called for his resignation over wearing blackface. I think that the violation of prosecutorial independence and pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould and the findings of the Ethics Commission constitute a resignation kind of an offense. What it does do is, this is a hard time to answer a difficult question. I know I have to leave, but I'll just say quickly that this is not a small issue. Systemic racism is a large issue. People of privilege, which is most of us around this table, anyone with white skin is a person of privilege, whether you've been poor as a church mouse as you grew up. And it's hard sometimes to recognize that. I mean, I'm very grateful for the fact that my daughter is a student in social justice. And honestly, it wasn't that long ago she had to really acquaint me with the idea of privilege. I said, well, but I'm, struggling as a single mother when you were a kid. Do you think we had privilege? She said, yeah, because we white faces, Mom. So yeah, okay. So I've gone through my process of recognizing we have privilege. Unconscious racism is still racism, but putting on blackface is hardly unconscious. You don't even begin to believe that it could happen with someone who is, and Justin also said that when he was vetted by the Liberal Party, he never told them those videos existed or those photos existed because he was ashamed. I believe, as a Christian, I believe in forgiving people. It's a personal forgiveness, but it doesn't deal with the harm that's done to people who are harmed.
But what about your God?
He is beyond contrite. One Halloween episode once. He's absolutely mortified. Greg Malone, as I said at the time, objected to the script. I don't think it's comparable to, well, I think Justin Trudeau's conduct is
So you'll let Barney Lancaster stay at the
yes,
party?
yes, because his explanation and his apology and his mortification. He came to me personally in Toronto yesterday at a press conference to say, "If you want me to step down," but I am so mortified. I didn't even think about it when I chose it as a Halloween costume. So it's a conversation. I don't think it's good enough to say Canadians are now having a conversation we should have had a long time ago about systemic racism. But if we want to talk about systemic racism, we also ought to bring into the conversation the Indian Act and the need for justice, truth, and reconciliation in a very big way. The fact that there's more children in care now who are Indigenous than in the height of the residential school system. We've got a bigger conversation to have about racism.